The member from Kenora-Rainy River.
Thank you, Speaker. It's a privilege to be able to rise this morning and speak on Bill G55, which is titled the Stronger Protection for Ontario Consumers Act, which is said to offer new protections for door-to-door water heater sales, real estate transactions, and debt collection. While this bill is a step in the right direction, there are other steps that could be taken and other areas such as the door-to-door sale of energy contracts that also require attention. Now, previously I did a 2-minute hit where I explained how the sale of door-to-door energy contracts is related to this, and that's basically because Schedule 2 is modeled after some of the reforms that this government made in 2010. And there is a correlation between the sale of door-to-door energy contracts and water heaters, and in fact many of the companies that offer one service offer the other. The very fact that we tolerate door-to-door sales of these goods makes it extremely difficult to monitor the tactics and the techniques that are used by these companies, and basically ensures that abuses will happen. In fact, when it comes to energy retailers, the Ontario Energy Board has now released a list of the top 10 complaints from consumers, and despite action aimed at curbing these behaviors in 2010, as I mentioned, it's clear that they are still occurring across this province. These issues like the general contract not conforming to regulation, cancellation charges being too high and unfairly applied, the reaffirmation call,
member from Algoma, Manitoulin,
something that the Act wants to add to the door-to-door sale of water heater contracts, either is not happening or the customer trying to get out of the contract at that time is not having their wishes respected. So despite clear changes that are supposed to curb this behavior, the misrepresentation of identity, in other words, the salesperson claiming to be with a government agency or a utility, continues to be high on the complaint list, as is the failure of companies to process cancellations. Another problem that has always existed is that the customer is not receiving a copy of the contract, which has been a considerable problem, particularly in the cases of forgery and fraud on the part of the salesperson, which has been mentioned by a number of speakers even just this morning. In addition to the Ontario Energy Board, to them continuing to report the failures and these changes, failures to properly verify the contract and the persistent sales tactics often are happening still, and they scare people. And so the question is, why do these abuses exist? I believe they exist largely in part because we continue to allow the door-to-door sale of long-term contracts, particularly in the case of energy retailer contracts, where the retailer is nothing more than a middleman, and the retailer doesn't provide any good or service in return for the huge profits they reap. The only real cost for doing business for these retailers is the cost of commissions that feed the greed of the door-to-door salespeople, and the fines that may or may not be leveled by the Ontario Energy Board that can catch, when we can catch somebody in the act of these violations. Again, it's extremely hard to prove that misrepresentation happens when it happens on the doorstep, because it's often a case of one person says, another person says. So why do people turn to these services? In my experience, in a lot of cases, it's fear or coercion, but with a lot of people, it's also desperation because of the artificially high prices that we're paying for energy in Ontario as a result of government policy. The 2011 report from the Auditor General noted that about 15% of residential customers had signed on with electricity retailers in hopes of driving their costs down, but instead they were paying 35 to 65% more. At the same time, he noted that 17,000 complaints from the public in the last 5 years, of those, and the overwhelming majority were regarding electricity retailers, leading one to question why, if the government is so concerned with consumer protection, they're not taking meaningful steps and not tackling this problem head-on and banning the sale of door-to-door long-term contracts altogether, to force these operators to appeal to potential customers through more traditional means, such as advertising, which can be done with greater government scrutiny. Yet despite the apparent failure to get the energy retailers under control, the government seems content to transfer many of these failed strategies to the door-to-door sale of water heaters, which at best is kind of a questionable tactic. What's worse is the people who are victims of these circumstances are often those who can least afford it, like people on Ontario Works, WSIB claimants, seniors, those living on a fixed income, those with mental disabilities, students just out of school, and others who are struggling to pay their bills. Many of these people are so desperate for relief from their high bills that when someone comes knocking to their door, guaranteeing them savings on electricity or natural gas, they're quick to sign on the dotted line. And while the government has set regulations on what can be promised, and in fact that savings can't be promised, it continues to allow these sales to be made using methods where the enforcement is really negligible, like on the doorstep. That said, it's good to see the government is trying to do something to protect consumers. If nothing else, this bill is at least a general recognition on the part of the government that it has a role to play in consumer protection, although I believe that the government has a stronger role to play. But it's not just government. We as MPPs have a tremendous power at our fingertips if we choose to use it. If we choose to speak up on an issue, people will listen to us, and many of us are provided with the tools like weekly columns, member statements, and other activities where we can take part to raise consumer awareness. One of these initiatives that I've taken on personally to raise awareness is with RFID identity theft. That's radio frequency identification, and the steps that consumers can take to protect themselves. I've used my office and to come up with, purchase some sleeves that people can put their bank and credit cards in, and I've let people know that starting next year they're going to have to be wary of their passports that come because they're going to have the same technology. So we do have some power as MPPs. But other things that the government can do, the government can have a boosted role in raising awareness of such issues such as scams, phishing schemes, email fraud, and other things. That wouldn't be a bad thing. In fact, I would say it would be a big positive. It's something that won't cost a lot. Again, it's just we need to have the will to do it. And certainly this government has been involved in ad campaigns before on things like healthcare and education. And while some of those may have been employed at questionable times, others haven't been, and such as organ donation. And I believe that the government could go a lot further with raising these issues. Reaching out into communities and sponsoring awareness sessions and other events could go a long way towards promoting consumer awareness. And part of the reason why I'm so passionate about this issue is that I've worked with so many people across Kenora-Rainy River over the past number of years who have been scammed, mistreated, and even lied to. And before I was elected, I spearheaded dozens of information sessions on energy retailers across my riding, and including I targeted Ontario Works administrators, and I asked if it would be possible for me to organize an information session and speak to all of the Ontario Works recipients about their rights, about energy retailers, what to look for, and to show them copies of some of the prepaid credit cards and the checks that they may not realize that by just depositing them into the bank, they're entering into a 5-year contract. So I've seen the sense of helplessness and the embarrassment that people feel when they've been misled. Many of them are reluctant to come forward because they feel like it's their fault. Then they don't realize that these abuses are happening to people across the province, regardless of any mitigating factors. I've personally helped doctors, nurses, teachers, and community business leaders just as often as I've helped seniors and people on Ontario Works or WSIB. The point is, regardless of the steps we take to crack down, regardless of the fines that we levy or the threats that we make, the only way that we're going to ultimately curb these behaviors is through education, making the public aware. And I'll admit the government has some documents out there that are intended to protect consumers, and many of them are helpful. Some of the documents that the Ontario Energy Board has are a prime example of that. But the problem is that nobody wants to believe that they're going to be the ones who are going to be swindled. Nobody wants to believe that they will be the ones falling prey to a scam. People are proud and they don't want to admit weakness, and that's why we need a strong consumer advocate. That's why we need to enhance our roles in the community. And there's no reason why, Service Ontario or the OPP can't be holding information sessions across the province to make people aware of some of the scams and to bolster some consumer awareness. But most importantly, we need to crack down on the practices that we know are unethical. And I think it's fair to ask why we allow energy retailers to continue to offer contracts when we can virtually guarantee that they can't provide savings. There's always going to be scams. But why aren't we taking steps to level the playing field? Maybe we need to take drastic steps by eliminating the cancellation fees of certain services, by allowing cancellations at any time, by increasing the fines and penalties for violators, revoking licenses, and taking stronger actions. And if the steps that we are taking aren't working, we need to be willing to admit it and to take immediate action. Thank you, Speaker.
Thank you.